The year Heaney spent with his young family as a visiting lecturer in Berkeley was a vital broadening of opportunities. It wasn't merely a question of, as he put it, silence, exile and sunning. He found the freewheeling academic culture and the novelty of Californian life in the late hippie era unimaginably different from Queen's and Belfast. The excitement is tangible in letters he wrote to friends at home. He was revelling in the intellectual camaraderie of people from all kinds of backgrounds and shaking off what he called his northern clay. Nonetheless, Irish connections on the Berkeley faculty were important. The critic and later great historical novelist Thomas Flanagan became one of Heaney's closest friends. In subsequent years, the two would make summer expeditions to historic Irish sites. It was a stop-off at Moran's Pub and Restaurant in Kilcolgan, County Galway, en route to Yeats's Tower at Ballylee, that inspired Heaney's celebrated poem, Oysters. The literary culture of Berkeley acted as a kickstart for the next phase of Heaney's writing life. As he puts it himself, what the Californian distance did was to lead me back into the Irish memory bank. I was starting to see my own situation as a northern poet, more in relation to the wound and the work of Ireland as a whole. In 1972, after returning from California, he published Wintering Out, which comes to grips with the descent into violence in Northern Ireland between 1969 and 72. Internment, riots, bombs in shopping centres, the bloody Sunday shootings of civilian protesters by paratroopers. The return from silence, exile and sunning could not have presented a bloodier contrast. Subtleties and tolerances, in Heaney's own phrase, were at a discount. The poems bleakly confront buried history and inheritances, as well as the dark side of community life. But subtleties and tolerances remained at the heart of Heaney's life and art, and he evoked them in a quintessential poem called The Other Side. The title at once evokes the physical geography of neighbourly relations, but it's also a phrase in Northern Irish parlance to denote a different religion. The poem profiles a Protestant farming neighbour of the Heaney family and culminates with the farmer making an evening visit. He tactfully remains outside until the family has finished saying the rosary. The delicacy of the poem avoids sentimentalism or wishful thinking. Its conclusion epitomizes exactly what Heaney could do and what his imitators could not. But now I stand behind him in the dark yard, in the moan of prayers. He puts a hand in a pocket or taps a little tune with the blackthorn shyly, as if he were party to love-making or a stranger's weeping. Should I slip away, I wonder, or go up and touch his shoulder and talk about the weather or the price of grass seed? Appearing when it did, the spirit of the poem spoke to those subtleties and tolerances, the dignified social observances which Irish people, particularly in northern rural communities, recognise and, at that terrifying moment, clung to. Not for the last time, part of Heaney's importance to his readership lay in their hope for a better future. But in many other poems, the Irish landscape is a nightmare terrain, and the homely rural imagery is put to brutal uses. Currents of violence and desperation pulse through poems dealing with lovers' quarrels, abandoned children, and folk tales of mermaids and outcasts. A poem such as The Other Side has to be read against this evocation of historical and psychological damage. Above all, the theme of violence, observed and buried, climaxes in an extraordinary poem, The Tolland Man. It was sparked by Heaney's reading of a book about prehistoric Danish bog burials and the evidence that the bodies preserved in peat had been ritually killed. Here, Heaney found an encompassing image for land, violence, and the preservation of antagonistic identities through the ages. Writing in 1974, he described his journey to Jutland the previous year as a pilgrimage. I remember driving through flat, misty country with a dyke and the North Sea on one hand, low fields on the other, and these silent hives of earth lying all about, and experiencing a sense of the oddness and ghastliness of the whole territory. He wrote The Tolland Man at a sitting, late at night, and changed it very little. The body dredged up from the bog had been sacrificed to a sexually voracious goddess, but the poet immediately connects the victim to more recent murders in his own country, sectarian rather than ritualistic. The scattered, ambushed flesh of labourers, stockinged corpses laid out in the farmyards, telltale skin and teeth, flecking the sleepers of 4 young brothers, trailed for miles along the lines. Here, finally, the poetic stance of observation and the tribal impulse of identification come powerfully together. He will visit Aarhus to look at the corpse. Out there in Jutland, in the old man-killing parishes, I will feel lost, unhappy, and at home. In 1972, the Heaneys took the decisive step of leaving Northern Ireland and moving south to the Republic, to a rented cottage an hour's drive from Dublin near Ashford, County Wicklow. It involved giving up his post as a lecturer at Queen's University and raised questions about the perspective from which he would write about his native province. There's a defensiveness in his account of the decision to move. From an interview in 1979, I left not really out of any rejection of Belfast, but because I had the name for being a poet, but was also discovering myself being interviewed as more or less a spokesman for the Catholic minority during the early stage of the Troubles. I didn't feel that my work was sufficiently at the centre of my life. I wanted to leave Belfast because I wanted to step out of the rhythms I had established. I wanted to be alone with myself. To some northern minds, Heaney, already suspect from his Californian sojourn and Faber connections, had decamped to a mixture of Grub Street and Sodom rather than a damp cottage on an obscure country road in County Wicklow. At the same time, Dublin was within easy reach, and life in Glanmore was not a hermit's existence. He presented a fortnightly book programme on Irish radio for the next 5 years and almost immediately was appointed to the Irish Arts Council. The work which germinated at Glanmore established his fame at a new level. His next book would take as subject the province he had left behind. Early drafts were called Northerners and The North. Instead, Heaney reduced it to the forceful single word which suggested a direction as well as a place. The frisson of reading North in 1975 was unforgettable, a chill and a recognition. The inheritance of northern horrors had been approached by other poets, but Heaney's excavation of what he once called the tribal dirt was overwhelming. Readers thought, so it can be written about, and this is how. In the notebook in which Heaney drafted many of the poems, images of bones, exhumations and violence recur. They move from archaeology to ritual to funerals. Now, as news comes in of each neighbourly murder, we pine for ceremony, customary rhythms, the temperate footsteps of a cortege winding past each blinded home. I would restore the great chambers of Boyne, prepare a sepulchre under the cup-marked stones. More controversially, the poem Punishment conjures up with unbearable exactness the image of a girl killed for sexual transgression. Her shaved head, like a stubble of black corn, her blindfold a soiled bandage, her noose a ring to store the memories of love. And here the poet introduces himself to transcribe a daring arc forward to the present. My poor scapegoat, I almost love you, but would have cast, I know, the stones of silence. I am the artful voyeur of your brain's exposed and darkened combs, your muscles webbing, and all your numbered bones. I who have stood dumb when your betraying sisters called in tar, wept by the railings, who would connive in civilized outrage, yet understand the exact and tribal intimate revenge. The reference to women in Northern Ireland punished for going out with British soldiers was unmistakable. Other poems followed this theme more graphically and used the metaphor of sexual intercourse as an image for British colonialism. The poems in North were grimly executed, Heaney said long afterwards, and I really like them because they're odd and hard and contrary. Whatever you say nothing is a lacerating humorous commentary on how sectarian signals operate in the North. Religion's never mentioned here, of course. You know them by their eyes and hold your tongue. One side's as bad as the other, never worse. Christ, it's near time that some small leak was sprung in the great dikes the Dutchmen made to dam the dangerous tide that followed Seamus. Yet for all this art and sedentary trade, I am incapable, the famous. Northern reticence, the tight gag of place and times. Yes, yes, of the wee six I sing, where to be saved you only must save face, and whatever you say nothing. Smoke signals are loud-mouthed compared with us. Manoeuvrings to find out name in school, subtle discrimination by addresses with hardly an exception to the rule. That Norman, Ken and Sydney signalled prod and Seamus, call me Sean, would surefire pape. O land of password, hand grip, wink and nod, of open minds as open as a trap, where tongues lie coiled as under flames lie wicks, where half of us, as in a wooden horse, were cabined and confined like wily Greeks, besieged within the siege, whispering Morse. In November 1976, the Heaney family moved to a house in Sandymount, Dublin. It looked out over the Strand walked by James Joyce's Stephen Douglas and wasn't far from the Martello Tower at Sandy Cove, immortalised in the opening scene of Ulysses. But the cottage at Glanmore remained a sacred space, and Heaney would eventually buy it from the friend who had let it to him. The distance and concentration conferred by his upstairs study in the cottage enabled a shift to a more direct and personal voice. It was like starting again. I wanted to use the first person singular, to use I in the poems and make it closer to the I of my own life. I wanted people who know me to feel, when they lifted the book, that this voice and the noises in the poems were quite close to the noises that I would normally make in friendly, intimate situations. I remember that I wrote to somebody that I don't want any more doors into the dark. I want a door into the light.
Adrian Dunbar.